It began with a sealed conversation inside Clarence House, one so sensitive that even senior aides were reportedly asked to leave their phones outside the chamber doors. But when King Charles III emerged from that meeting looking visibly shaken, palace insiders immediately sensed that something irreversible had happened. Within hours, whispers spread across royal corridors that Prince Philip's final legal protections had been activated, and Prince Harry was at the center of the storm. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. For years, Frogmore Cottage had stood as more than just another royal residence tucked behind the guarded calm of Windsor. To the outside world, it was presented as Harry and Meghan's final remaining foothold inside Britain after the collapse of their working royal roles. But according to reports now circulating through palace administrative circles, the estate may have always ride restrictions far deeper than the public ever understood. Sources close to former royal staff whisper that Prince Philip viewed certain crown-linked residences not as emotional family gifts, but as protected institutional sanctuaries tied to the long-term survival of the monarchy itself. And insiders claim that shortly before his death, the late Duke of Edinburgh quietly reinforced legal directives connected to occupancy rights surrounding Frogmore estate directives that were allegedly designed to activate under very specific circumstances. At first, many within royal circles reportedly dismissed the sudden legal review as routine estate housekeeping. After all, Prince Philip's private papers, trusts, and property instructions had remained heavily protected since his passing. But then came the unusual activity around Windsor property offices. Courtiers allegedly noticed senior legal advisors moving in and out of meetings with an urgency rarely seen outside constitutional crises. Administrative files connected to Frogmore were reportedly re-examined. Security staff were quietly updated. Even longtime household aides, according to insiders, began whispering that something was changing. And at the center of every conversation sat the same painful reality. Prince Harry may have believed Frogmore would always remain accessible to him, while hidden mechanisms inside Philip's will allegedly suggested otherwise. The emotional toll on King Charles reportedly became visible almost immediately. Palace sources claim the monarch entered the Clarence House meeting hoping for flexibility, perhaps even a path toward preserving some symbolic bridge between Harry and the institution he had left behind. But the deeper the legal teams examined Philip's directives, the clearer the situation allegedly became. This was no temporary adjustment, no negotiable misunderstanding. Reports suggest the executors made it painfully clear that certain protections surrounding Frogmore had been deliberately constructed to prevent future disputes over royal property access, occupancy, and institutional privilege. Charles, according to multiple palace interpretations, suddenly found himself trapped between two identities he could no longer balance. A father desperate to prevent further fracture within his family, and a king sworn to uphold the very structures his father had spent decades defending. And then came the involvement of Princess Anne and Prince Edward, two figures insiders increasingly describe as the quiet enforcers of Prince Philip's final worldview. While Charles reportedly wrestled emotionally with the consequences, sources claim Anne viewed the matter through an entirely different lens. To her, according to palace whispers, this was not about punishing Harry. It was about protecting what remained of institutional authority after years of public turmoil. Prince Edward, long described by royal commentators as one of the monarchy's most meticulous guardians of protocol, was allegedly involved in reviewing estate language tied to occupancy conditions and crown-link protections. Together, reports suggest they supported the strict interpretation of Philip's wishes, even as Charles privately struggled with the human cost of what was unfolding. Outside palace walls, media speculation exploded with remarkable speed. Royal correspondents began noticing signs that something extraordinary was happening behind the scenes. Security discussions surrounding Windsor intensified. Commentators referenced sensitive property realignments. Even journalists, usually cautious about internal family matters, hinted that a major shift tied to Harry's remaining royal ties was underway. And yet the palace itself maintained near total silence, fueling even greater suspicion. Why now? Why would Prince Philip's directive suddenly emerge with such force years after his death? Some insiders believe the answer lies in the final years of Philip's life, when reports suggest he grew increasingly alarmed by the widening divide between Harry and the institution itself. Various interpretations from former staff members claim the Duke feared that emotional grievances, media warfare, and public accusations were eroding the very foundations the monarchy depended upon for survival. That fear, according to palace whispers, may have shaped every safeguard hidden inside his final estate planning decisions. Because beneath the legal language and quiet meetings sits an even darker possibility now haunting royal insiders. Prince Philip may have anticipated this fracture long before the rest of the world saw it coming. And if those reports are true, then Frogmore Cottage was never simply a home at all. It was a line Prince Philip allegedly decided the monarchy could never allow itself to cross. But the real shock was not simply that Harry had been barred from Frogmore, it was why Prince Philip allegedly made certain that outcome unavoidable long before anyone saw the family fracture coming. Long before memoirs, interviews, and royal exile shook the House of Windsor, Prince Philip reportedly viewed Frogmore Estate as something far greater than a residence. To him, insiders claim, it was part of the monarchy's sacred geography, a protected royal enclave that could never become leverage in family disputes. And according to whispers now emerging from Windsor circles, he quietly prepared legal safeguards to ensure exactly that. For decades, Frogmore existed in a strange and powerful space inside the royal system. It was not Buckingham Palace with its state grandeur, nor Balmoral with its emotional ties to Queen Elizabeth II. Frogmore carried something quieter, but perhaps even more important, a sense of protected continuity buried deep within Windsor itself. Palace historians have long described the estate as part of the monarchy's inner sanctuary, woven directly into the institutional fabric surrounding succession, privacy, and royal preservation. To various interpretations now surfacing from former staff and administrative insiders, Prince Philip reportedly became increasingly protective of that sanctuary during the final years of his life. Sources close to Windsor whisper that he feared the monarchy was entering a dangerous modern era where royal properties could slowly become emotional bargaining chips inside family conflicts, rather than protected symbols of the crown's permanence. At first, those concerns allegedly remained private. Philip, by most accounts, was never a man drawn toward emotional public confrontations. Instead, insiders claim he approached problems the same way he approached duty itself, with silence, structure, and long-term calculation. Reports now suggest that behind closed doors, he quietly reviewed estate arrangements tied to several royal residences, including Frogmore Cottage, as tensions surrounding Harry and Meghan steadily intensified. The deeper the Sussex split grew, the more questions reported. Why emerged within palace circles about how crown-linked properties should function when senior royals stepped away from institutional obligations. And according to whispers now spreading through Windsor administrative channels, that was the moment Prince Philip allegedly decided certain legal boundaries needed to be reinforced before future disputes spiraled beyond control. What makes the situation even more explosive is the growing belief among palace observers that Philip never viewed royal residences as personal gifts in the first place. To him, insiders claim, these estates belonged to the institution before they belonged to any individual family member. That philosophy, royal historians now argue, closely mirrored Queen Elizabeth II's deeply rooted belief in duty over blood, the idea that preserving the monarchy sometimes required painful sacrifices within the family itself. Reports suggest Philip feared emotional favoritism could weaken the crown's long-term stability, especially during a period already filled with public controversy, media warfare, and internal division. And so, according to sources familiar with the duchy structure and estate protections surrounding Windsor properties, restrictive clauses tied to occupancy rights and succession access were allegedly embedded into legal frameworks connected to Frogmore long before the public understood why they might matter. The implications reportedly hit King Charles with devastating force once those protections resurfaced during legal reviews connected to Philip's estate. Palace insiders claim Charles entered the discussions hoping there might still be room for flexibility, perhaps even reconciliation. But the more advisors examined the directives, the clearer the reality allegedly became. Frogmore was never intended to operate as a permanently inherited sanctuary detached from royal duty. Reports suggest the estate protections were specifically designed to preserve institutional authority above personal relationships, even if enforcing them created emotional destruction inside the family. Charles, according to several palace interpretations, found himself staring directly at the same impossible conflict his parents had faced for decades: the painful collision between private love and public obligation. Meanwhile, anxiety reportedly spread rapidly through palace offices as aides began fearing a backlash that could erupt if details surrounding Philip's restrictions became public knowledge. Courtiers allegedly worried the situation would deepen public sympathy for Harry while simultaneously exposing just how rigid the monarchy's internal structures could truly be. Some insiders claim even senior staff were stunned by the depth of Philip's long-term planning, particularly the possibility that he had anticipated future fractures within the family years before they fully exploded into public view. Because behind every legal clause, every estate protection, and every quiet directive now sit as a haunting question spreading through Windsor itself. Did Prince Philip already see where this story was heading long before anyone else was willing to admit it? Yet what truly stunned royal insiders was the growing belief that Philip's restrictions were not accidental legal formalities, but a direct response to tensions he had quietly witnessed during his final years. According to various palace interpretations, the fracture inside the royal family did not begin with interviews or documentaries, it began with trust. And by the final years of Prince Philip's life, reports suggest that trust had been catastrophically broken behind closed doors. The Duke of Edinburgh, once fiercely protective of Harry, allegedly came to view the escalating conflict as a threat not merely to family harmony, but to the monarchy itself. For much of Harry's early life, palace insiders often describe Philip as one of the few senior royals who truly understood the burden of existing inside the crown while ultimately resisting parts of it. The Duke of Edinburgh had spent decades surviving storms that nearly shattered the institution itself. And according to various royal commentators, he once believed Harry possessed the same resilience, the same understanding of sacrifice, and the same instinct for duty beneath his rebellious image. That is why insiders claim the collapse of trust inside the family reportedly wounded Philip on a deeply personal level during his final years. What began as concern slowly evolved into something colder, heavier, and far more dangerous. Sources close to former household staff whisper that the Duke increasingly feared the monarchy was no longer dealing with a temporary family disagreement, but a long-term rupture capable of destabilizing the institution from within. The turning point, according to numerous palace interpretations, allegedly arrived during the aftermath of the Oprah interview. While the world watched the emotional fallout unfold publicly, reports suggest the internal reaction inside royal circles was even more explosive than most people realized. Senior aides allegedly viewed the accusations not simply as personal grievances, but as a direct challenge to the legitimacy and integrity of the monarchy itself. But for Prince Philip, insiders claim the pain was even more devastating because it struck at something he valued above almost everything else: loyalty to the crown during moments of institutional vulnerability. Sources suggest the Duke was deeply wounded by the idea that deeply private royal tensions had become global public warfare. While the monarchy was already navigating Prince Philip's declining health and Queen Elizabeth's growing physical exhaustion, and according to whispers now emerging from Windsor circles, that emotional damage never fully healed. As the public criticism intensified, reports suggest fears also began growing behind palace walls that royal residences and institutional privileges could eventually become symbolic bargaining tools in wider family conflicts. Frogmore Cottage, in particular, reportedly became a quiet source of anxiety among senior royal advisors. Palace insiders claim some feared the estate's continued association with Harry and Meghan could slowly evolve into leverage against the institution itself, especially as tensions with Buckingham Palace deepened across interviews, memoirs, and media projects. Whether those fears were fully justified remains heavily debated among royal historians. But according to various interpretations from administrative staff and former courtiers, The perception alone was enough to trigger serious internal concern. And once that concern reached Prince Philip, insiders whisper that his thinking allegedly shifted from emotional reconciliation toward institutional containment. That shift reportedly aligned closely with the growing influence of Princess Anne and Prince Edward behind the scenes. Both had long been viewed within royal circle as fierce defenders of protocol, structure, and continuity. Sources claim Anne, in particular, became increasingly alarmed by what she allegedly saw as the erosion of emotional loyalty toward the institution itself. Reports suggest she quietly pushed for stronger estate protections and firmer boundaries surrounding royal privileges tied to official duty. Edward, meanwhile, reportedly focused on the legal and administrative implications of preserving crown-linked properties from future uncertainty. Together, insiders claim they helped reinforce an emerging consensus within the palace that sentiment alone could no longer guide decisions tied to royal assets and institutional authority. Caught in the middle of this widening divide stood King Charles III. Reports suggest the future king spent years attempting private reconciliation efforts with Harry, hoping emotional bridges could still be rebuilt before the damage became irreversible. Sources close to palace operations claim Charles R. repeatedly searched for compromise, even while pressure from senior royal figures continued mounting around him. But the deeper the conflict spread, the more isolated he reportedly became. Because while Charles still saw his son through the lens of family, others inside the institution increasingly viewed the situation through the lens of survival. Royal commentators now describe the entire fracture as a devastating battle between legacy and personal grievance, between a monarchy desperate to preserve stability and a family relationship collapsing under years of mistrust, anger, and public exposure. And perhaps most painful of all was the growing belief among insiders that Prince Philip himself had reached a heartbreaking conclusion before his death. Emotional loyalty to the crown had fundamentally eroded in ways the monarchy could no longer ignore. That realization, according to palace whispers, may have shaped every safeguard, every restriction, and every legal protection quietly embed Harry dead into his final directives. But while Harry may have believed time would eventually soften the palace position, insiders now whisper that an entirely different force had already begun moving behind the scenes, the executors carrying out Philip's final instructions. The moment reportedly arrived in silence. No public announcement. No dramatic confrontation. Just legal documents, private consultations, and a devastating realization unfolding behind Windsor walls. According to insiders familiar with royal administrative channels, Prince Philip's executors allegedly confirmed that Frogmore protections could not simply be overridden, not even by the king himself. What stunned palace insiders most was not merely the existence of the restrictions, but the cold precision with which they were reportedly designed to operate. Sources familiar with Windsor estate procedures claim the executors arrived at the confidential briefing carrying layers of legal documentation tied directly to Prince Philip's final estate framework. At first, according to palace whispers, many believed the meeting would simply clarify technical property matters surrounding Frogmore Cottage. But as legal advisors began reviewing the directives line by line, the atmosphere inside the room allegedly shifted from cautious discussion to something far heavier. Reports suggest the executors reaffirmed that occupancy protections surrounding Frogmore were linked to institutional conditions that could not easily be ignored or softened through personal intervention. Even more shocking, insiders claim the framework had allegedly been structured in such a way that emotional appeals carried almost no legal weight once the process had formally begun. For King Charles, the moment reportedly landed like a private catastrophe unfolding in slow motion. Sources close to palace operations claim the monarch sat through the briefing visibly shaken as advisors carefully explained the implications buried inside Philip's directives. The deeper the discussion went, the clearer the reality allegedly became. Frogmore Cottage was not simply governed by personal preference or family sentiment. According to various interpretations now circulating through royal circles, the estate had quietly become part of a broader long-term crown preservation strategy designed to protect institutional continuity during periods of instability. And once those mechanisms activated, Even the sovereign himself reportedly faced severe limitations in altering their course without triggering legal and constitutional complications that palace officials desperately wanted to avoid. That realization, insiders whisper, created one of the most emotionally painful moments of Charles's reign so far. Because while the public often views kingship as unlimited power, palace aides claim the monarchy operates within rigid internal structures built over generations precisely to prevent emotional decision-making from destabilizing institutional authority. Ritty. Legal advisors allegedly warned Charles against interfering directly with Philip's directives, cautioning that attempting to bypass the restrictions could create dangerous precedent inside Crown estate management. Reports suggest several officials privately argued that weakening the framework surrounding Frogmore would risk undermining the very principles Philip had spent decades defending. And so Charles reportedly found himself trapped in a brutal contradiction powerful enough to wear the crown, yet emotionally powerless to shield his own son from the consequences now unfolding. Behind the scenes, Princess Anne allegedly emerged as one of the strongest defenders of maintaining the institutional line. Sources claim Anne viewed the situation not through the lens of family heartbreak, but through the harsh logic of royal continuity. According to insiders, she reportedly believed that once exceptions began overriding formal structures, the monarchy itself entered dangerous territory. Frogmore, in her view, was never about revenge or punishment. It was about preserving the integrity of the institution at a moment when public trust had already been deeply shaken. Prince Edward, meanwhile, allegedly played a central role in reviewing estate language tied to succession clauses and occupancy protections. Long regarded by palace staff as one of the monarchy's quietest but most disciplined figures, Edward reportedly focused heavily on ensuring Philip's directives were interpreted exactly as intended, regardless of the emotional fallout surrounding Harry. As word of the internal briefing slowly spread through royal administrative corridors, courtiers began describing the atmosphere around Windsor as icy and unavoidable. Some insiders claim even longtime staff members felt stunned by how absolute the legal situation appeared to be. Others reportedly feared what might happen if the public ever fully understood how deeply institutional concerns had overtaken personal reconciliation inside the House of Windsor. Because beneath every legal consultation and confidential memorandum sat an undeniable truth that no one inside the palace could comfortably escape anymore. Prince Philip's final safeguards were no longer theoretical protections sitting quietly on paper. They were active forces reshaping the monarchy's future in real time. And perhaps nowhere was that emotional devastation more visible than in King Charles himself. Reports suggest the monarch left several private discussions exhausted, withdrawn, and increasingly aware that the distance between Harry and the institution might now be widening beyond repair. What began as quiet estate management had evolved into something far darker, a symbolic struggle over loyalty, duty, inheritance, and the very meaning of belonging within the monarchy itself. But as the legal machinery closed around Frogmore, the emotional cost for King Charles reportedly became impossible to ignore, and insiders say the monarch began realizing just how trapped he truly was. For years, King Charles III reportedly tried to balance two worlds that were increasingly impossible to reconcile: the private instincts of a father and the unforgiving obligations of a monarch. But sources now suggest that Prince Philip's will forced him into the very confrontation he had spent years trying to avoid. And this time, there was no room left for compromise. By the time the full implications surrounding Frogmore Cottage reportedly reached the king's desk, insiders claim Charles already understood the emotional damage waiting on the other side of the decision. According to palace whispers, he had spent years quietly hoping the distance between Harry and the monarchy might eventually soften. Even after interviews, public accusations, and increasingly hostile media narratives, sources suggest Charles still believed there could one day be a path back towards some form of fragile reconciliation. But the deeper advisors examined principle. NCE Philip's directives, the clearer the reality allegedly became. Frogmore was no longer simply about accommodation or symbolism. It had evolved into a constitutional pressure point tied directly to the monarchy's credibility, consistency, and long-term authority. And once that realization settled across palace corridors, the king reportedly found himself facing the very dilemma he had spent years trying to outrun. Reports from royal insiders describe deeply difficult estate discussions unfolding behind closed doors, where Charles allegedly appeared visibly exhausted by the weight of the situation. Some courtiers claim he entered multiple private consultations hoping legal flexibility might still exist somewhere within Philip's framework. Others whisper that he repeatedly questioned whether exceptions could quietly be made without destabilizing the broader institutional structure. But according to sources familiar with the internal conversations, each answer reportedly led back to the same cold conclusion. Intervening emotionally risked weakening the monarchy's entire position at a moment when public trust was already under strain. Palace officials allegedly feared that if Frogmore protections were softened for personal reasons, critics would accuse the crown of inconsistency, favoritism, and institutional weakness. And for a monarchy already battling questions about relevance, loyalty, and survival in a modern world, insiders claim that fear carried enormous weight. At the center of the internal pressure reportedly stood Prince William, whose position allegedly aligned closely with the institutional line supported by Anne and Edward. According to palace interpretations, William increasingly viewed the issue not as a temporary family disagreement, but as part of a broader struggle over the future shape of the monarchy itself. Sources suggest he believed maintaining clear boundaries between royal privilege and royal duty had become essential after years of escalating public conflict. While Harry once represented continuity within the next generation of the House of Windsor, reports now claim William feared the institution could not survive prolonged ambiguity over roles, responsibilities, and access to crown-linked assets. That perspective allegedly strengthened the resolve of senior palace figures who believed Frogmore needed to remain part of a disciplined long-term preservation strategy rather than a lingering emotional compromise. Princess Anne reportedly delivered the harshest institutional argument of all. According to insiders, she repeatedly warned that exceptions create fractures, within royal systems already struggling to maintain authority under relentless public scrutiny. To Anne, sources claim, the issue was never personal cruelty toward Harry. It was about protecting structural discipline before emotional flexibility created larger instability later. Reports suggest her position carried enormous influence precisely because she had spent decades earning a reputation as one of the monarchy's most uncompromising defenders of duty. And as pressure mounted around Charles, insiders whisper that Anne's argument became increasingly difficult to resist. Once institutional rules bend for sentiment, the crown risks losing the very framework that allows it to survive generational turmoil. Yet behind every legal discussion and constitutional concern remained the deeply human tragedy at the heart of the conflict. Sources suggest Harry had long viewed Frogmore Cottage as more than just property. It reportedly represented his final secure foothold within Britain, his last symbolic connection to royal life after the collapse of his working role inside the institution. Losing that connection, according to commentators close to royal affairs, carried both emotional and financial consequences that stretched far beyond the estate itself. And perhaps no one understood the devastation more painfully than King Charles. Palace insiders claim the monarch fully grasped what Frogmore's loss would mean to Harry not simply as a residence, but as confirmation that the distance between him and the monarchy had become terrifyingly real. That realization reportedly haunted Charles throughout the estate crisis. Because despite the crown, the protocol, and the constitutional machinery surrounding him, sources suggest he remained painfully aware that this was still his son standing on the other side of the decision. But as legal obligations tightened and institutional pressure intensified, the king allegedly began understanding something even more devastating. The monarchy itself had already moved beyond the point where emotional compromise alone could stop what was coming next. And yet, even as the king wrestled with heartbreak behind palace walls, the monarchy itself appeared to be moving toward a colder conclusion one Prince Philip may have anticipated years earlier. Inside royal circles, some have reportedly begun referring to the entire affair as the Frogmore Directive, a quiet but ruthless enforcement of the old guard's philosophy that the crown must always survive personal emotion. And according to palace whispers, Princess Anne became one of the strongest defenders of that doctrine once Philip's intentions were fully understood. To outsiders, the conflict surrounding Frogmore Cottage may have appeared like another painful chapter in an already fractured royal family story. But inside palace walls, insiders claim the situation evolved into something far more serious. According to sources familiar with internal discussions, the estate became symbolic of a larger battle over whether the monarchy would continue operating through emotional exceptions or return to the unforgiving discipline that once defined the institution for generations. And at the center of that shift reportedly stood Princess Anne. Long viewed as one of the monarchy's most iron-willed figures, Anne allegedly interpreted Prince Philip's directives not as punishment aimed at Harry, but as a final institutional safeguard designed to protect the crown from future instability. Palace insiders whisper that once the late Duke's intentions became fully clear, Anne reportedly saw little room for hesitation. To her, preserving structure mattered more than preserving comfort. That belief, according to various palace interpretations, slowly hardened into what insiders began privately describing as an iron protocol surrounding estate integrity and royal privilege. The philosophy behind it was reportedly simple, but brutal. Access to the monarchy's protected spaces must remain inseparable from loyalty, duty, and institutional responsibility. Sources claim Anne feared that once emotional negotiations started overriding long-standing royal frameworks, the monarchy would lose its ability to enforce boundaries altogether. And after years of public turmoil surrounding Harry and Meghan's departure, many within the old guard alleged Ly believed those boundaries had already been pushed dangerously close to collapse. Frogmore, in that context, transformed from a residence into a test case for the monarchy's authority itself. Prince Edward reportedly stood firmly beside Anne throughout the unfolding crisis. Though far quieter in public, insiders describe Edward as deeply committed to protecting Prince Philip's legacy exactly as intended. Sources claim he played a critical role behind the scenes reviewing estate structures, occupancy conditions, and succession-related clauses tied to crown-linked properties. Together, Anne and Edward allegedly formed a united front committed to ensuring Philip's final directives were not diluted through emotional pressure or public sympathy. Reports suggest both believed that allowing institutional uncertainty around Frogmore would weaken the monarchy during a period already defined by instability, public criticism, and growing constitutional anxiety. At the same time, Prince William reportedly aligned closely with the broader long-term modernization strategy taking shape around the future monarchy. According to royal commentators, William increasingly viewed the crown's survival as dependent upon clarity, discipline, and a far more streamlined interpretation of royal privilege. Sources suggest he believed public trust could not survive endless ambiguity surrounding who remained inside the institution and who operated outside of it, while still benefiting from symbolic royal access. Frogmore therefore allegedly became part of a larger effort to redefine the monarchy around active duty rather than inherited emotional entitlement. Insiders claim this emerging philosophy resonated deeply with Anne's belief that preserving the institution sometimes required painful separation from sentiment. And somewhere in the middle of this hardening institutional alliance stood King Charles, reportedly becoming more emotionally isolated with each passing stage of the dispute. Palace aides whisper that while Anne, Edward, and William increasingly focused on continuity and structure, Charles remained painfully aware of the personal devastation unfolding behind every legal directive. Sources suggest he understood that Frogmore's loss represented far more than property for Harry. It symbolized another severed connection to the royal world he once called home. Yet despite those private emotions, insiders claim Charles also recognized the growing fear spreading throughout palace operations. If exceptions surrounding Frogmore appeared politically motivated or emotionally inconsistent, public confidence in the monarchy's internal discipline could weaken even further. That fear reportedly became one of the defining forces driving the palace toward its increasingly rigid position. According to various interpretations from royal observers, senior figures inside the institution had reached a chilling conclusion after years of crisis. The era of royal privilege detached from royal duty was ending. Some insiders even describe quiet conversations within palace corridors carrying the same brutal phrase again and again, "The party is over." In other words, access to the monarchy's protected sanctuaries could no longer exist independently from visible institutional loyalty. And as that philosophy tightened around Frogmore, the estate itself slowly transformed into something much larger than a disputed residence. It became the monarchy reclaiming control over its own boundaries after years of emotional chaos, public rebellion, and internal fracture. But perhaps the most unsettling part of the entire affair was the growing realization that Prince Philip may have anticipated this institutional reckoning long before anyone else inside Windsor was prepared to confront it. Because beneath every legal safeguard, every estate clause, and every quiet directive now sits a darker possibility haunting royal insiders. Frogmore was never intended to be temporary leverage or emotional compromise at all. It was designed to become a final line protecting the future shape of the monarchy itself. But the most chilling realization was still to come, because insiders now believe Frogmore was never simply about property at all. It was about legacy, succession, and the monarchy's future survival after Charles himself. Behind the legal clauses, the property disputes, and the emotional headlines, palace observers claim a far larger struggle has quietly been unfolding inside Windsor. Who truly belongs inside the monarchy's future? And according to interpretations now surfacing around Prince Philip's final wishes, Frogmore may have become the ultimate line in the sand. For years, the public conversation surrounding Frogmore Cottage focused almost entirely on residency, who lived there, who paid for renovations, who retained access after stepping away from royal duties. But inside palace walls, insiders now claim the estate carried a far deeper meaning than most people remember. Realized. According to various royal interpretations, Frogmore gradually transformed into a symbol of institutional loyalty itself. It was never simply about maintaining a home inside Britain. It became a silent test of whether someone could continue standing adjacent to the monarchy while openly distancing themselves from the responsibilities, structures, and discipline that defined it. And as tensions between Harry and the palace escalated over the years, sources suggest senior royal figures increasingly feared that leaving Frogmore untouched would blur the line between royal identity and personal independence in ways the institution could no longer safely manage. That fear, insiders whisper, reportedly echoed Prince Philip's deepest concerns during the final chapter of his life. According to palace observers, the Duke allegedly believed the monarchy was entering one of the most fragile periods in modern royal history. Public trust had become unpredictable. Internal divisions were played out globally. Every interview, every memoir excerpt, every accusation against the institution allegedly carried consequences far beyond temporary headlines. Reports suggest Philip feared the reputational damage could eventually harden into something permanent if the crown failed to reassert clear boundaries around privilege, loyalty, and institutional belonging. To him, according to various interpretations now circulating through royal circles, Frogmore represented one of those boundaries. A quiet but powerful line separating emotional connection from active participation within the monarchy's protected inner structure. At the same time, the future of Prince William's eventual reign reportedly became increasingly tied to the idea of a smaller, tighter, and more disciplined monarchy. Royal commentators claim William has long understood that public tolerance for royal ambiguity is fading rapidly in the modern era. Sources suggest he believed the institution could no longer afford blue-red definitions surrounding who represents the crown and who merely retains symbolic proximity to it. In that context, Frogmore allegedly evolved into more than an estate dispute. It became part of a larger effort to redefine the monarchy around visible service, accountability, and institutional clarity. Insiders claim this emerging philosophy aligned closely with the views of Anne and Edward, who reportedly saw strong boundaries as essential to preserving stability during future succession transitions. That pressure, according to palace whispers, increasingly closed around King Charles himself. Sources suggest the monarch understood that any hesitation surrounding Frogmore risked creating perceptions of inconsistency at the very moment the crown needed discipline most. And yet every legal consultation reportedly carried painful emotional consequences, because Harry was not simply another distant royal relative, he was still Charles's son. Palace aides claim the king struggled deeply with the symbolic weight attached to the estate, because he reportedly recognized exactly how Harry viewed it. Frogmore represented continuity, memory, connection. Perhaps even the final remaining bridge back into the royal world that once defined his identity. But insiders whisper that once Harry's distance from official royal duties hardened into long-term separation, negotiations surrounding the estate allegedly became almost impossible to disentangle from broader institutional concerns. Royal commentators now increasingly describe the entire conflict as one of the clearest modern examples of duty over blood inside the House of Windsor. According to various interpretations, the palace ultimately prioritized structural preservation over emotional reconciliation, because senior royal figures believed the survival of the monarchy demanded it. Frogmore therefore allegedly became a form of symbolic containment, an effort to reinforce the idea that royal privilege could no longer exist independently and independently from institutional responsibility. Some palace aides reportedly feared that failing to act decisively would create confusion not only within Britain, but across the Commonwealth and international audiences already questioning the monarchy's cohesion. And yet, outside palace walls, public sympathy often moved in the opposite direction. Many observers reportedly viewed the entire affair through a far more personal lens, focusing less on constitutional discipline and more on the emotional fracture unfolding within one of the world's most famous families. That contrast created a haunting divide between the palace's internal rigidity and the public's emotional understanding of Harry's position. Because while the institution may have viewed Frogmore as a necessary line protecting the monarchy's future, millions watching from afar still saw a son losing one of his final connections to home. And as the dust settled around Frogmore's gates, one painful truth reportedly remained hanging. Over Windsor itself, the monarchy may have preserved its structure, but at the cost of another fracture within the House of Windsor. Now, behind the quiet stone paths of Windsor and the guarded gates of Frogmore, an icy silence reportedly lingers over the royal family. Not the silence of peace, but the silence that follows a decision too painful to reverse. And according to palace insiders, King Charles understands that this moment may define not only his reign, but his legacy as a father. In the weeks following the final enforcement of the Frogmore restrictions, sources close to royal operations claim the emotional atmosphere inside Windsor changed dramatically. Courtiers allegedly described the king as quieter, more withdrawn, and visibly weighed down by the personal consequences of the decision that had now become impossible to undo. While the palace publicly maintained its familiar composure, insiders whisper that Charles privately understood the true cost of what had happened. Beneath every legal document and institutional argument sat a devastating reality that no constitutional briefing could soften. His own son had become increasingly distant from the royal world that once shaped his entire identity. Reports suggest the king wrestled deeply with the knowledge that Frogmore Cottage had represented one of Harry's final emotional anchors inside Britain. And now, according to palace observers, even that connection appeared to be slipping away. Yet within royal circles, Frogmore was no longer viewed merely as a residence dispute. It had become symbolic of something far larger than the monarchy choosing institutional survival over emotional reconciliation. Sources claim senior palace figures increasingly believed the crown could no longer afford uncertainty surrounding privilege, access, and loyalty after years of public turmoil. According to insiders, that belief only strengthened after Prince Philip's final directives resurfaced with such force. Some royal entertainers now describe the late Duke's influence as operating from beyond the grave, shaping major royal decisions long after his death through the structures and safeguards he allegedly put into motion during his final years. And as those protections tightened around Frogmore, many within the palace reportedly began viewing the entire affair not as temporary conflict management, but as the enforcement of a long-term institutional philosophy designed to preserve the monarchy during an era of growing instability. At the center of that philosophy stood Princess Anne and Prince Edward, increasingly viewed by palace insiders as the quiet guardians of crown continuity. Reports suggest both remained unwavering in their belief that preserving institutional discipline mattered more than emotional flexibility, particularly during a period already marked by constitutional anxiety and public distrust. Anne allegedly continued arguing that once exceptions begin overriding royal structures, the institution itself risks losing authority over its own boundaries. Edward, meanwhile, reportedly focused heavily on protecting the integrity of Prince Philip's intentions, ensuring that every estate clause and succession-related safeguard was interpreted exactly as designed. Together, insiders claimed they represented the old guard's final defense against what they feared could become a dangerous erosion of royal discipline. At the same time, Prince William's future monarchy reportedly continued moving toward a far more streamlined and tightly controlled structure. According to royal observers, the Frogmore affair reinforced William's growing belief that the monarchy's survival depends upon clarity, accountability, and visible institutional loyalty. Sources suggest he increasingly views the future crown as one centered around active duty rather than symbolic attachment. And in that future vision, insiders whisper, there may be little room left for blurred identities existing simultaneously, inside and outside the institution. Frogmore therefore allegedly became more than a painful family dispute. It became an early blueprint for the monarchy William may one day inherit and reshape entirely. For Harry, however, the consequences reportedly cut far deeper than headlines alone could capture. Palace commentators suggest the loss of Frogmore represented another critical crossroads in his already fractured relationship with the institution. Not simply because of the estate itself, but because of what it symbolized. Reports claim many close to royal affairs now view the entire episode as a warning about loyalty, consequence, and the brutal realities of a monarchy that ultimately prioritizes continuity above personal emotion. Public sympathy may continue shifting toward the emotional wounds inside the family, but insiders insist the palace increasingly sees the matter through an entirely different lens. Survival first, reconciliation second, and perhaps that is the most haunting page. Art of all. Because despite the pain, despite the fractures, despite the emotional devastation surrounding Harry and Charles alike, the monarchy itself appears to have endured exactly as Prince Philip allegedly intended. The institution survives. The structures remain standing. The boundaries have been reinforced. But according to palace whispers, the emotional scars left behind may never fully disappear. The House of Windsor has protected its future, but in doing so, it may also have deepened one of the most painful divisions in modern royal history. Because in the House of Windsor, insiders whisper that properties can be reclaimed, titles can be adjusted, and privileges can disappear overnight, but once trust inside the crown is broken, the silence that follows can echo across generations. Thanks for watching! Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.